Good evening to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Khulud. I organize with the Ottawa Coalition for a People's Budget, and I'm collaborating with Horizon Ottawa for today's event, along with the Farnaz and Inez. I just want to acknowledge that we are gathering on the unceded, unsurrendered, stolen territories of the Algonquin people. And part of the work that we do is making sure that we are contributing towards a city that really does represent everybody's needs, everybody's a way for everybody to live equitably in the city. So that's part of our work and our mandate as the coalition and in all of the work that we do. So welcoming everyone, and I hope that this is an informative event for all of you. And please do wait until the end. If you have any questions, we will have an open Q&A session. And as well, feel free to use the chat option if you have any difficulties accessing the conversation that we're having today, and Sam and Farnaz will be able to assist you in that. Next slide, please. Awesome. So just as we were saying, the Ottawa All Budget Coalition is a coalition of groups that comes together every year to look at the city budget and essentially assess how the city budget needs the asks and demands that we have as a coalition. So for the past 2 years, we've been putting together an alternative budget document that looks at where expenditures are being made and where money can come from to invest in the core needs that the city has, and also accounts for the different changes that would be required for us to work our way towards a city that really represents needs for all. I just want to start the conversation today by just talking about why it is important to engage with city budgets. And city budgets are annual documents that dictate how spending across all major social, economical, cultural, and infrastructural aspects of the city happens. Every year, we get to see where the city is prioritizing expenditures and what is being spent on. And the city budgets are in themselves a really valuable opportunity for residents to come together and provide input on what their aspirations for the city look like and what areas they think the city should be investing in. One of the things that always comes up with city budgets is the annual property tax rate, and that's sort of where the city decides how much residents are going to be paying in property taxes. And oftentimes that's all that city budgets become about. So part of what we're trying to do today is expand on the dialogue that we have around city budgets and the importance of engaging in the city budgets. I also just want to highlight at this point in time that for years now, the way that the city budget gets tabled and the way that the engagement around the city budget happens is a very closed process. It's often not accessible to everybody. We usually see the budget getting tabled a month or maybe a little bit more before the vote happens. And then over that month between the tabling and the voting, we'll see councillors engage with their constituents. And then there's an opportunity to present at different committee meetings. What we're contending is that's still a very close process, and that does not allow for valuable input. Oftentimes, by the time that the city budget is tabled, there isn't much room for changes to be made. It doesn't really leave room for participatory action to happen around the budget. So since the inception of the coalition, we've been calling for more open processes and more participatory processes around community engagement with the city budget that includes residents from all walks of life. Next slide, please. So just some quick highlights about what's in Budget 2023. So as many of you might have already heard, since this got covered in a lot of media as well, the Budget 2023 is mainly and largely an austerity budget. It's been called a tight budget, a belt-tightening budget, where the city is looking at efficiencies and seeing where it can cut cost to respond to like the inflation crisis, the increase in cost of living and cost of everything else crisis. So that's really what we're seeing in the budget. The expenditures that we are seeing, some of them, the biggest one is in Ottawa Police, which is seeking $15.2 million for the 2023 budget to hire 25 new staff members. And this police is also seeking between $23 to $60 million to triple its capital budget to put together towards infrastructure projects. The only efficiencies that we see in police budget are around $500,000. When it comes to transit, that's where the biggest efficiencies in the budget are happening. So the city this year has committed to freezing transit fares in responding to the affordability crisis in the city, and as well is looking at saving $47 million by getting rid of 117 old buses that it doesn't use, and by putting off contributions to future capital projects. The fear is that the buses that are being they're going to get rid of are not going to get replaced, and that could affect R1 bus routes when the LRT goes down. So that might be a possible impact that we're seeing. In housing and homelessness, we're not seeing any major new increases in the budget. The city has been for the past many years investing a $15 million budget in building affordable housing. But the tricky part about this amount is that this is often combined with investments from other levels of government, and as well is often rolled over into the next year. So sometimes it gets very hard to tell how that $15 million is translating to exact number of units on the ground. Oftentimes the funding also gets rolled over into the next year as well. So on their website, the city said that the $15 million is being used to support thousands of new units and supportive housing units. But again, more clarity is yet to be desired for all of that. Next slide, please. Awesome. In terms of transportation, there is $55 million being allocated to road widening and expansion, including the Airport Parkway widening, which is around $21 million. And that's a very controversial topic amongst local residents. This is compared to only $14.8 million in improvement in new pedestrian and cycling infrastructure and road safety programs. In terms of environment and climate change, only $5 million for this year towards the climate change master plan, and then no commitments to funding energy evolution. And then finally, in terms of community and social services, the budget includes 2% increase in recreation fees, which is in line with previous budgets, but as well includes a promise to make recreation and cultural programming more affordable for low-income families. So we are seeing a $4.55 million investment in community safety, well-being, and social investments. These investments are timely, but are really dwarfed by the cost of living crisis that we're seeing all across Ottawa today, and as well are dwarfed by the demand for additional funding that's made for police personnel, which we know will not solve any crises in the community and will not really add to any sort of transformational social change. Next slide, please. So part of why we do this exercise every year is really to encourage people to imagine a city beyond what is told to us every year in the budget documents. The goal is to highlight the power that the city itself has as a jurisdiction in making social change and in making deep and substantial investments into the community. For years now, we've seen municipal governments sort of hot potato how much they can actually do for the city. And the alternative budgeting exercise allows us to imagine what is within the purview of the municipal government and how can we see more substantial investments in housing, in community services, and in transit. So the alternative budget at the end of the day and the whole process of engaging with the budget just allows us to engage in community advocacy that envisions transformative roles for the city government in building a better city. And then most importantly, I think a quick last point that I want to make also is, even as we see investments come in, one of the things to keep in mind, and something that I've seen after being engaged with city budgets over many years, is oftentimes we see a positive change like the freezing of transit fares or, you know, an investment in a certain sector. But that change comes after years and years of community advocacy. And oftentimes by the time that it comes, the cost of living crisis or other crises in the communities have escalated to such a point that that individual policy doesn't really bring around the change that we expect or want to see in the community. So even as I look at something like freezing of transit fares, which I remember a couple of years ago, we had advocated for so much, now that becomes a valuable but a very minimal change in what we would actually like to see in investments in the city. So it's really important to keep in mind what we can expect from city governments to do and what kind of investments we do want to see from them to address the crises that we see on the ground. Thank you. Next slide. Awesome. I'm just going to hand it over to Inez now, who's going to go over all of the technicalities of the budgeting process and just go over how we can engage in the budget in more real ways.
Awesome. Thank you, Khulud. So hi, everyone. My name is Inez. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm an economist at Vivic Research. So we're an Ottawa-based economic consulting firm. And yeah, the next 10 or 15 minutes or so, I'm going to go over the budget in a little bit more detail and give some context as to how to better understand the actual tables that are put out in the city's budget document. And so in the future, if you're looking to get involved and participate in some of the budget consultations, hopefully this will give folks a few tools in order to fully understand the documents being put forward and to engage. So starting from this, really the most kind of like crucial part of understanding the city's budget is that there are two components to it. There's the operating budget and the capital budget. The operating budget is day-to-day service delivery, and that budget needs to balance. So the city can't go into debt in order to provide those daily services, but they can for the capital budget. And the capital budget is where the spending is to maintain, to improve, and then to fund new infrastructure. So all those taken together, generally the conversation is focused on the operating budget. It's what you hear the most about. It's what generally gets the most traction. But the capital budget is very important. I mean, in terms of one, maintaining and investing in new infrastructure, but also investments in infrastructure can foreshadow investments in then day-to-day service delivery that become necessary once you start expanding infrastructures in a certain service or a certain sector. So just for putting this into a little bit of context, making it a bit more applicable, for example, if you had a transit operator, their salary would fall in the operating budget, but bus purchases, that's going to be capital budget. In the same vein, if you had like the salary of a police officer, that's going to be coming in the operating budget, whereas the expansion to the south facility is going to be spending that you'll see in the capital budget. And that's a good example of somewhere where for years, you'll see just small investments in the capital budget. And then at the end, you end up with new facility, and that is going to require major investments in the operating budget in order to staff and in order to run the day-to-day activities of those facilities. Can you go to the next slide, please? So yeah, so looking in a little bit more detail at some of the graphics that the city put out in terms of the operating and capital budget, it is important to mention that a lot of the documents put out by the city are in multiple different pieces. So there's not one big comprehensive budget at this time, but there are the budget books for different sectors. And it makes it a little bit hard to get a full picture of what the city is spending on and where are we seeing increases, where are we seeing decreases, and why. But hopefully some of this information from the main documents that they put out can be helpful. So the first thing that we see is the operating budget. So the one for day-to-day spending is now equivalent to $4.5 billion, and just a bit less than half, so 46% of it is coming from property tax. So property tax does get like the bulk of the conversation. It's generally what's most talked about when we talk about city budgets, but in reality, there are many other components that make the city budget, mainly 23%, so just less than a quarter coming from federal and provincial and municipal grants, so other levels of government investing in the city. Those are often like investments in healthcare. A lot of that comes provincially, so that's where you would see those. And then fees and services, so transit fees, recreation fees, all that is going to also fund the day-to-day operations of the city. So, sorry, next slide. In terms of the city spending, so again, because it's the operating budget, it has to balance. This is also equal to $4.5 billion. And this is probably the most comprehensive graphic that they put out, but in a lot of ways, it can be misleading. So the first thing that really jumps out is the biggest share of the budget is going to community and social services, so just under $1 billion spent there, followed by transit at $700 million. And then very equal amounts capital formation costs, which is investments, and then the Ottawa Police Service. So when the information is presented in this way, it makes it a little bit challenging to actually draw conclusions on what is being spent on. So one of the big situations here is that certain slices of this pie, so to speak, are representing only one service. So the Ottawa Police Service, the Ottawa Public Library, and Public Health, that's their full budget, and that's represented accurately, the amount of money that they're getting. In other spaces like community and social services, you're grouping together spending on all sorts of different areas, ranging from housing to healthcare to spending on recreation, and that is all contained into one sector. So it's really hard to say in terms of, you know, is this a lot? Is this a priority? It depends on how you make these groupings because they also change from year to year. So while the city does put out similar graphics, what is contained in community and social services isn't always the same. And that does make a difference in terms of how that information then ends up being talked about in the general conversation. Next slide, please. So then going over the capital budget, this year the spending is anticipated to be just over $1 billion. Oftentimes, spending in the capital budget is going to be shown for like 10 years at a time or at least 5 years at a time because these are large projects, so they tend to be budgeted for in advance. But this is just zooming in on 2023. The main difference here is that unlike the operational budget, there can be debt. So about a quarter of the budget is coming from debt servicing. Other than that, revenue is still making up a very small share. So this is like that revenue that the city generates is almost entirely in the operating budget. And then the reserves making up a pretty big chunk of where the funding is coming from. Sorry, next slide. So in terms of the capital program spending this year, a little bit less of distinction and disaggregated than the operating spending, but one of the main areas that also comes up is police services, and this is probably the only like individual slice. Like we're not seeing public health, public library, like those areas that you do see in the operating budget aren't prevalent in the capital budget. And that's important to keep in mind because when we talk about the inflated police budget, we're only talking about the operating budget, and we don't mention that the capital budget is also growing rapidly. So what we're seeing 2023, $60 million, that is about 40 million of that is going towards the new South facility, 20 million towards new technologies, and those spendings do have ripple effects in coming years. Yeah, next slide. And so then just diving a little bit more into the property tax impacts, because it does take up a large chunk of the conversation. It is a very important source of financing for the city. The way that the property tax operates based on where you live, so the urban-rural divide, the property tax does change a little bit to be cognizant of the fact that there are fewer services available to folks living in rural communities. And the way they present is for the average assessment value that they're showing at $415,000. Your average property tax for that person would be roughly $4,000 in an urban setting and $3,400 in a rural setting. At the same time, for commercial properties that don't have that same urban rural tax rate, the tax rate would be $8,700. The way that they disaggregate it isn't super transparent. I mean, they've grouped citywide as, you know, a huge chunk of it in terms of where the increase is going, but police and transit do make up a very significant share of the property tax. And generally the conversation around, you know, where your property tax dollars are going isn't an accurate reflection of the way that it is disproportionately funneled into police and transit. It's important to note that the transit fee is significantly higher for people living in urban settings, whereas the policing fee is flat across the city. Next slide. Okay, so this is a little bit technical, and it's not necessarily meant to focus exclusively on policing. It is really understanding how to read the budget document to draw information from it if you want to speak at the committee meeting. So the main things, kind of drawing attention to the red arrows, is just understanding the different numbers that tend to come up in conversation around budgeting, but do represent different things. On my scene, I see the bottom as cut off a little bit. I don't know if other people also see that. So like I see the first arrow and half of the second one. I'm not sure if there's a solution to that, but I did want to point that out. But the idea here, so this is a screenshot of the Ottawa Police Services operating budget. And there are a lot of numbers that come up often in conversation that aren't necessarily given full context when discussed. Oh, that's perfect. Thank you for that fixes it. So the big one that people are going to talk about is gross expenditure, which is the total budget. So it's just how much the Ottawa Police has to spend in the year. And that's at $401 million this year. And so that's generally a number that comes up a lot, but at the same time, when discussing how much money is coming from the city, that's the second arrow that you see at the bottom, the $359 million. So there is a bit of a difference between how much money the police has to spend and how much money they get funded from the city. And the difference there is going to be money that they recover through recoveries and allocations. So right below the first arrow, you see $4 million in recoveries and allocations, bringing their net expenditure, so the total of what they spend, to $396 million. That number is going to come up a lot because where you see like the pie chart that the city puts out, the 8.9% is in reference to this $396 million. When the police budget documents are released and they're talking about their total budget, they're referring to the $401 million. And when conversations around city investments in policing, the number to reference would be the $359 million coming directly from the city. Other sources of money that they get, the province, the federal government, small amounts of money, and then fees and services. So if you were paying to get a police report or freedom of information request, that is fees that they charge. And then fines that they also charge, and they're able to collect that revenue as their own revenue. So this is going to be similar kind of layout that you'll see throughout the budget documents. Like if you're opening the community services budget, it's about 197 pages, but for every different department, you'll get one of these tables and those same types of expenditures. So you'll see gross expenditure, total revenue, and then net requirement, the money from the city. You'll see that throughout. Okay, I think that's all. Yeah, so the last point about budgets before talking a little bit more about the alt budget, but talking a little bit about the narrative around increases and decreases in city budgets, I think is important to consider because there are different ways of measuring how much money each service or department has. So you could talk about the share of the budget, but you can also talk about the increase that they're getting or decrease from year to year. And then you can talk about the total budget that they have access to. And those are important metrics. All of them have their own use, but oftentimes can be used in ways that mostly fit a narrative rather than provide the most accurate information that you would need to make an informed, to form an opinion around the issue. So this is a comparison between the 2015 operating budget, so again, that day-to-day spending, and then the 2023 operating budget. And there are a few things to keep in mind. So the first one being that think of the share of the budget. I guess a way that I find helpful to think about is thinking of the budget as a piece of pie. So the share of the budget would be how much of the pie you have, so how big your slice is, but your total budget is going to be how much pie you have on your plate. And so you can have more and more pie on your plate every single year, even though your slice is getting smaller, because every year the budget grows, like the size of the entire pie expands. And so in conversations around police and police budgets, one thing that comes up is that the share of the Ottawa Police budget is shrinking. And it's a conversation that can have a lot of nuance. I mean, if you look back historically over 20 years, the share of the budget is growing. But if you start looking in the mid 2010s, the share of the budget does start to decrease. But that conversation doesn't take into account a lot of really important context. So first, if we look at 2015, we see the share of the budget is 10%. And then in 2023, it's dropped down to 8.9%. Part of that is that in 2015, the budget was $3 billion and is now $4.5 billion. So there's just a lot more to go around than there has been 8 years ago. It's also, if you look at the total amount of money they have, so the amount of pie on their plate, in 2015, they had 295 million, and now they have 397 million, so just shy of 400 million. And so that's a huge increase in terms of the actual budget they have, whereas the share of the decrease in the share of the budget isn't that noticeable and is pretty similar to a lot of other services. So I'm not going to compare the Ottawa Police budget to the community and social service budget just because what is included in that changes from year to year. I don't think it's an accurate comparison, but comparing it to the Ottawa Public Library, which is also just a single institution, we see their whole budget. In 2015, they had 2% of the budget, and now it's dropped to 1.4%. So also a decrease, but they also have more pie on their plate, so to speak, going from 48 million to 60 million. But when you put that into perspective, so we're looking at over a $200 million increase for the Ottawa Police and a $12 million increase for the Ottawa Public Library. So really looking at what aspects of the budget are we talking about is really important in conversations. When conversations around, is it increasing, is it decreasing? These are just important things to keep in mind. Next slide, please. So in terms of takeaways from this section, really the main thing that stands out, especially in putting these slides together, was just the lack of transparency around the city budget does make getting involved more difficult. It makes it so that most of the information that people have is directly shared through the city and through their summarizing of the budget, which we know leaves out a lot of key information. But hopefully some of the tools here today will be helpful in terms of looking through some of the budget documents in more details. Another reality that comes up is that even in the city's own communication, they admit that from year to year, the budget doesn't change much. And they attribute that to all sorts of different regulations and limitations that they have in terms of how the budget is put together through committees, meaning that they as a whole have very little control over the entire budget. But that information is quite misleading. So the decisions that they do make maintain the status quo. And that's part of why the alternative budget is such an important exercise, because it shows that you're not actually tied in such concrete ways to always funding the same things. And you can start shifting towards more community-oriented spending if that was being prioritized. So if you can go to the next slide, the next section, I know we want to have time for the panel, but looking a little bit about what was proposed in last year's alternative budget, just to give some context as to what could be possible. So going over this fairly quickly, the ideas put forward in the alternative budget do look at expanding the revenue available to the city of Ottawa. And I will put one big disclosure that the alternative budget, we just do one. There was no capital budget and operational budget. It's one entire balanced document. So realistically, there's a lot more potential than even what we've put in the alternative budget, because this is, not taking into account that you can go into debt to build housing. None of that is featured in the budget because we're really trying to show that you can make these changes, and both in terms of increasing your revenue and making spending that benefits the community. So a lot of the legislation put forward was tax oriented, so land transfer tax, non-resident speculation tax, and vacant tax, implementing a stronger vacant unit tax. And then in the following slides, we'll look a little bit about the spending, but I don't think we'll dive in too much. So do you want to go to the next slide? In terms of the Ottawa Police budget, one of the main areas that we focused on in the alternative budget was shifting money away from the police towards community services. And this slide, although there are 3 years of data that we can now include, this is pulling from last year's resources, do show this steady increase in police budget. So this isn't like the total amount of money they have available. That is disproportionate compared to other city services. Sorry, next slide. So yeah, diving into a little bit what defunding the police would look like under the people's budget, because this was a really core part of our vision. But the idea was that we could draw money from the police budget and divert it towards community services. So we didn't only divert money that was coming from the city, but also looking at provincial and federal funding, as well as fines and fees. The idea that, you know, if someone were to pay a fine or someone were to pay a fee to have access to information, they could go access that through the city, and then the money would be put into like the general pot and could be spent outside of policing. Where the reductions came, we pulled from non-frontline, non-criminal investigative services, which was a pretty big chunk of budget, so $90 million, and then defunding and detasking frontline policing. And the idea was with that money, we could directly reinvest in equivalent alternatives that we saw as ways to both introduce reactive responses in the city should something occur, but without undercutting any investments on prevention that are in the budget, like housing and childcare and other community services that can change and address root causes of instances that police currently respond to, but without having to have a reactive response in every situation, especially not a reactive response that we know can be harmful. All right, next slide. And for these next slides, I think we can go through them pretty quickly because this is just material from the alternative budget that I think is probably more interesting to look through in a less speedy way. But in terms of investments in housing, the main area that we were drawing revenue from was a vacant unit tax increase and places where we can invest. And this is mostly to show that a lot of the efforts that we put together in the alternative budget, because we had to balance the budget, are smaller investments than would otherwise be possible in housing, but still drastically more than the city currently invests. Mostly the $150 million investment in supportive housing units and affordable housing units. That was really important to us. But then also investments like establishing a tenants defense fund or adopting anti-displacement policy to protect affordable housing is stuff that is very much possible and does not cost the city drastic amounts. So are types of policies that we could realistically see implemented from year to year. Next slide, please. And this is just another way of looking at the cost of the proposed housing asks. So I think we can skip ahead from this. Yeah, and the last area that we wanted to focus on in the alternative budget was climate change. And the idea here that we put forward last year was that this would be, again, like a net reinvestment. So similar to the divesting of policing towards community services, this was divesting from fossil fuels and stock market investments towards climate action. So the idea was this was really like a net transfer of money, divesting $190 million to later reinvest it in a variety of strategies without actually increasing revenue or needing to raise tax revenue in order to make this possible. I think that is the last slide. Is that possible? Yes, absolutely. So yeah, that was all for me, but thank you for listening.
Thanks, Inez. And we're going to switch gears a little bit. So thanks. I'm for everyone who I'm Sam. I'm with Horizon Ottawa, and so that beginning part for folks who watch was some more of an informational part about the current budget and the issues with it, and some information, some highlights, and also our alternative budget, but as well as great points from Inez from Vivic Research on who helped develop the alternative budget in the past 2 years, on how to read the budget, because it isn't an accessible document for a lot of people. But the next part of this discussion is going to be a sort of panel on you know, people's experiences delegating, and some tips and things like that. And then if folks have any questions, I see in the chat there, we'll go to that. But before we go to that, I guess just because the slide is here, and I'm going to bring up back the slide up before the end of the presentation as well. But I just wanted to show folks the schedule here, because one of the things obviously that's important and that people don't really know about is when these meetings actually are and who to email to sign up to delegate at these meetings. I found out, you know, again today that there's actually no information really on how to register as a delegate on the city's website. You have to like go into the where they keep the agendas or the minutes from different meetings and see how to register that way. So we wanted to just give some more information there. So I just wanted to show people there some sort of brief timeline. Obviously, there's some dates from January that have passed already, so those excuse me, aren't really necessary. But there is a meeting coming up tomorrow, for example, the Finance and Corporate Services Committee, which is the FedCo committee, so the Finance and Economic Development Committee from last council, but they changed the name, and that's basically the committee with all the heads of all the other committees. And you could sign up to speak to that, but of course it's tomorrow, so it's a bit too late. But the big meeting this week that folks should look at to sign up to speaking at is the Transit Commission meeting. That's going to be on February 9th at 9:30 a.m. Of course, it starts at 9:30, but that doesn't mean you'll speak at 9:30. And at the end of this presentation, there'll be all the emails you can send to sign up for that. But as Khulud had mentioned earlier, there are some big cuts coming to transit, so it would be great if folks signed up to speak there. And I'll also mention that later on this week, we will probably create some sort of email campaign around that too, so look out for that. But the Transit Commission meeting on February 9th, this Thursday, if you have some time, you should definitely think about speaking at that. The other committees coming up, there's the Emergency Preparedness and Protective Services Committee. So that's, again, like separate from police, right? So that is like fire, paramedics, etc. And like emergency response. So response to like things like natural disasters, tornadoes, for example. If you want to talk about the city's response and how you think more money should go there, for example. And also, you know, how little paramedics we have in the city. I saw today there was an article about how we're only hiring in the next 2 or 3 years 14, 16 paramedics or something like that. And the head of paramedic services going on the radio saying that's not enough. We need at least 60, he said. So that's another thing to speak about at that committee, for example. The Planning and Housing Committee, of course, a lot to talk about the housing crisis on February 15th. The Audit Committee, not much there, but the Environment and Climate Change Committee, of course, lots to talk about there, February 21st. The Transportation Committee on February 23rd, Police Services Board on the 27th of February, but at 10 a.m. you can sign up to speak there. But we did not include on here, which is important, is that on February 15th at I think 10 a.m. there's going to be the Finance Committee for the Police Services Board, and that there was where they're specifically talking about the budget. So the 15th is certainly where people should sign up to speak, and that's going to be also the Coalition Against More Surveillance, which is a group that all of our groups here work with as well. Will be posting more information about that. So February 15th for the Finance Committee, Board of Health on the 27th, and the Community Services Committee, which is one of the last committees that meets before the budget is tabled, on February 28th, 2023, and also at 9:30 a.m. There's not a time there, but it's going to be in the morning as well. Folks want to sign up to speak there as well. And then the budget is tabled on the 1st of March. And then I'll also go, there's this here, and I'll also go here just before we go to the panel, because, as I said, we're going to put up these slides before the end of the presentation again. But these are just some emails of people, if you want us, some specific committees, if you want to sign up, you can take a screenshot of this, or we'll also post something like this on our Twitter as well afterwards. But these are some of the emails of people to email if you want to sign up to speak at different committees like the Transit Commission, the Police Services Board, Community Service Committee, Board of Health, etc., Transportation Committee, because all of these emails aren't listed on the city's website to sign up to delegate. So we wanted to post it here for people to look at. But of course, this will be we'll go back to this at the end of the presentation. And I think that might be the last slide, but we're going to go, I suppose we can sort of start with this slide about, it's a bit of a template for public delegation. And then I guess we can start off the panel with that. And I think, I don't know if Laura Shantz is here, but
yeah, I'm here.
Hello. Yeah. So we're joined by Laura, who, I'll let her introduce herself as well. But Laura is really involved with Ottawa Transit Riders, for example, and has spoken at a lot of committees and things like that before. So Laura has lots of experience. Inez will be joining the panel, as well as Farnaz, who is here, who is involved with Coalition Against More Surveillance and Vivic Research and other groups. I guess for now I'll probably take off the I'll stop the screen share and I'll go so we're in speaker view here, but I will just start off with a question for folks, and then we'll sort of switch between this and like people's questions in the chat if there are chats specifically about delegations and some things about the budget too. But I guess what we can start with more easily for people, and I'll go to Laura first. I guess I could just so what's your general sort of take, I suppose, on the budget more generally?
The current budget we've got, it's a little frustrating to see, I have to say, to put it politely. We heard so much during the election from all candidates, including the current mayor, about how it was time to do things differently, how it was time to have more transparency, more public input, really trying to be a for the people kind of stuff. And that's not what we're seeing. We're seeing basically a budget that's more of the same. There's a few little scraps thrown for community services, social services. And then when you get to budgets like transit, there are big holes in them. So a big chunk, when you hear that huge figure of 40, 50 million coming out of transit budget, one thing to remember is that a bunch of that money comes from capital. So they're kicking the can down the road when it comes to improvements and repairs and upgrading infrastructure. So they're not like chopping the service at your door on day one, but we've seen in the city what happens when you start pushing those expenses further and further and further back. And what we've also seen is that they've left I believe it's close to $40 million hole in the middle of the budget and said, oh, the province is going to give us money. They're going to put this money in here. Well, the province hasn't actually said jack all about giving us money. There's no money promised. There's just a hole there that the city says, you know what? We're going to get money. It's okay. Don't look there. Don't look there. We're going to get money. And the big question that I have, and I think a lot of folks should have, is what happens if that doesn't come through? Or what happens if those ridership projections are off, so that hole ends up being a little bigger than we think it's going to be? Because at 70% ridership of pre-pandemic levels, we're getting closer to what we've got now, a little bit more realistic. But we also need to remember that a lot of the changes that are going to happen in terms of people having to return to physical offices, a lot of those have already happened. The numbers, so we're not going to see huge ramp ups for what we've got now. And we've also seen a lot of people find new ways of getting around during the pandemic. They've taken up cycling, they walk more places, they moved somewhere more convenient, or where transit isn't a thing that needs to be part of their lives. So if I was to be doing a delegation, I would try to pick just one or two really clear points that ring true for you, talk about why they ring true, and ask what they're going to do about it. I know city committees get really grouchy and ants in the pants if you just pose direct questions to them. But, it's absolutely fair game to say, I'm a member of the public, and a question that I've been thinking about for myself is, this is my question that I'm thinking about for myself. And just kind of leave it sitting on the floor. And if there's a friendly counselor around the table, they are allowed to pick that question up and pose it to city staff. They are allowed to carry that ball for you. You're not allowed to technically pose those questions yourself, but in some of these spaces you're going to be delegating, there is going to be that friendly counselor who will just, happily tap that question along and say, we're going to need a clearer answer here. Let's do this. But one thing I've noticed, giving a lot of delegations myself and listening to a lot of committees and delegations, is that a smaller number of points delivered really clearly and with either a good personal example or with some facts to back it up, it does a lot more than just kind of doing the buckshot, the barn wall, and trying to get in every single point that has really been, upsetting you or frustrating you through the course of the budget. So that's something to think about as you're delegating, as you're prepping that delegation, and also thinking about timing, thinking about you've got 5 minutes maximum on the clock, and trying to make sure you get your points in a way that feels good, that you're not stressed and you're not rushed. To me, those are the big key points. And really, no one's here to tone police you. Say what you want to say it how you want to say it. I mean, don't go out and like be an abusive jerk, obviously, and like do personal insults, because that's not cool. But if you're angry, you don't need to be putting a nice face on that. You're allowed to be angry. Your feelings are your feelings. And I'm not here to tell you to be nice about it. Just get it out there, let people know what you're thinking, and yes, give them hell.
Thanks, Lauren. I think that's a good point. Like you don't have to be, super duper polite and nice, right? I mean, like, obviously, like, there's rules of decorum to respect for like multiple reasons, obviously, to be respectful, but also so they don't kick you out of the meeting because that's not effective for anyone. But it's important, it is effective, important to show some emotions and some passion about what you're talking about, because the reason people sign up for it and take the time out of their day is because they are passionate about it, for sure. So I see a question. I can go a bit more. There was a question in the document here that I have, but there's a question in the chat. I think it's a great question. And I'll go to, I see someone else with their hand up, but I would recommend, instead of putting your hand up, to put the question in the chat, because then that way I could see it before I ask it. And that's just easier for me. But this is a good question about thoughts from panelists on accompanying visuals. Does this make a delegation a lot more effective, or does it give committee members an opportunity to check out? I think that's a good question. Does anyone want to answer that?
I can jump in on that. In the past, we've done visuals when presenting at the Police Services Board. And honestly, I have mixed feelings about it. In large part because sometimes presenting at these meetings, it takes a lot of time to prepare. You put a lot of work into making these visuals. You take time into writing a delegation, and then you present. And it seems like this like high intensity, like 5 minutes, followed by often silence. If there isn't a friendly counselor in the room, if, a lot of people are speaking at the meeting and they're not engaging with people in order to run through all the delegates and get just past that community engagement portion, sometimes it can feel really frustrating to have put in that time and then feel not heard by the people you're presenting to. On another hand, sometimes I think it does actually help in terms of getting counselors involved. Like, I've never gotten the impression that it gives them a chance to check out. Oftentimes they'll ask you to send their materials and they can follow up with you. And it does give them something more concrete. I think sometimes it is hard for them listening to like these 5-minute speeches. People are talking fast. People are giving a lot of statistics and information, but you don't necessarily have a chance to get it down. And so then rather than like echoing the information that they're learning and getting it a little bit wrong, I think they steer clear from it. So I think if I had to give a recommendation, I'd say if you had something like already on hand that is easy for you to prepare, I think it can be super helpful. But I would be cautious in terms of like, if you feel that you're putting a lot of time into this, it's really stressful for you and you might not have a support after the meeting, and you don't have anybody to debrief with, it can just be an added challenge.
Anyone else want to add to that, or? Okay.
I guess, like, I'm of mixed feelings about it. Like, if it's not, for a lot of people, it can help you organize your thoughts. It can kind of give you something to start off of. But I also get kind of frustrated, especially like seeing the new OPSB rules, because sometimes you might hear things in the staff presentation that will come right before what it is you want to say. And you'd really like to address something that was brought up in that presentation, or you'd really like to, build on something that another previous presenter has spoken about. And so I would say, if you are planning a presentation, to still leave yourself some wiggle room and not tie it too tightly, to make sure you can still address or amplify those other points, and make sure that you're getting across all the messages you want to. Because sometimes you're sitting there listening and someone makes a really excellent point and you're like, I want to amplify that. I want to draw attention back to this. And if you've got your full 5 minutes planned, that might be tricky. So I'd say just, if you do, just do with the idea that you want to leave yourself some flexibility still.
Great. Yeah. And I guess I could just add that I think visuals are good to a point. Like as Laura said, it could make your presentation a bit too rigid, which you don't want. But also, I mean, like you only have 5 minutes. So if there's some issues with your presentation and with Zoom, and if it's not working or whatever, you could maybe spend too much time focusing on that rather than the content of what you're saying. And sometimes what I find more helpful is focusing more on, again, like statistics are great, but a bit more on like sort of like bringing some more personal sort of anecdote or whatever into it, sometimes a bit more. But of course, also counselors want to see that you know what you're talking about and things like that. But also just to add before we go on to the next question, of course, like a big thing that we want to get across here is that you don't need to be some sort of academic or expert to speak about what your community needs, because you live in your community every day, so you know you're an expert on your community and what they need. So you don't have to worry about statistics or anything like that. If you go to speak at Transit Commission on Thursday, for example, and you know what routes are being cut or what less transit means to your community or to you, I mean that's certainly something you can bring forward. And it doesn't have to be a 5-minute long speech. You could speak for 30 seconds to a minute, and show. And it means a lot to have a lot of people come out and speak in general, right? And also, of course, there's the opportunity to write. You can, any of those emails that I put up, you could to sign up to register. You can also just write, and then they will hypothetically send it around to counselors. I believe that they do that. So that's also something you can do if you can't or aren't able to speak, but it's great if you can. So before I get to because I see some great questions from the chat here, so I'm just going to continue with that before I go on to the prepared questions I have here. So there's one more. I see one from Lynn, but I'm going to just go with Letitia because she had her hand up before. But this is Letitia had 2 questions. There's one question about Bill 23, which I think is good to answer. But how is Bill 23 going to affect the budget this year? The reduction in what the city can charge developers. So for people who don't know, Bill 23 is a provincial bill that essentially takes away the city's ability to raise development charges, which are charges that the city was able to charge developers for things or fees around building stuff and things like that. So that was a big way that the city raised revenue, but those fees were also only to be used for particular things. So that the development charges can't be used for like everything. Was only for like to pay for development and things like that, costs related to development. But does anyone want to respond maybe how like that shortfall of revenue would affect the city? Inez, maybe? Do you have anything to say about that?
I think this kind of ties into a little bit what Laura was talking about at the beginning, that a lot of the development charge revenue goes into the capital budget. And so if you see a reduction in the capital budget, you're not going to feel those effects instantly. But then as they start investing less and less in maintenance, there's going to be more wear and tear depreciation on city infrastructure, and there's less opportunities for growth. So I think this is something that you would see the impacts of in the years to come, more so than some like immediate cuts to service that would come from there.
Great point.
One thing I've heard as well is that this year we've got, so basically there were a lot of new homes built last year. There's a lot of new property taxpayers, whether they're owners or renters, or a lot of new property taxpayers are coming onto the rolls this year. So there's going to be kind of a little wave of increased taxes from those folks. And they're saying that will help mask for the first little bit some of the effects of this, and that, as Inez said, in subsequent years, we're going to start seeing more and more effects of this.
Great, thanks. Farnaz, do you want to add anything to that, or no? Okay. There's another question here from Lynn. So when it says, can people accompany the group's speaker at the mic? This could show the counselors the numbers who support the cause. And 2, should delegations have a written statement to give out to staff, media, or others at the meeting? I don't know if I can just start with that. Like, so what you could do, and again, like you can either speak for most of them, except for the Police Services Board, you could speak either in person or virtually. I suppose you could go. I don't think there's anything that would stop you to go with anyone for support to speak there. You could also have your 5 minutes divided between multiple people, so you don't have to speak by yourself. There's no necessity to have a written statement that you would give to people, but you could do a written statement and hand it out to people if you wanted to. That's certainly something you could do. Does anyone else want to respond to that? Okay.
Sorry, what was the
Go ahead.
question?
Sorry?
What was the question?
So it was about people accompanying the group speaker at the mic. It says this could show councilors the numbers that support the cause, and should delegations have a written statement they can send out, pass out to people or the media or things like that.
Okay, I guess a lot of my engagement has been through the Ottawa Police Services Board, and a lot of the times, like, it's helpful and less intimidating to have a group of people to go with you, and a lot of the times we're all speaking to relatively the same thing, and I think that it does show that there's like a number of people who are calling for similar things, and I think that's actually maybe part of the reasons that they're making the changes that they're making through the bylaw that they're going to be voting on February 27th, and they're trying to limit the number of people who are going. So I do think it's like effective in certain ways. And then in terms of writing a delegation, if you submit it, I think they're changing the laws again, so it's going to be a bit different, but like the Thursday before the Monday meeting of the Police Services Board, then your written statement gets added to the agenda, and whether or not the members actually engage with it is unknown. Maybe some of them do, but it's good to have that there if you are not comfortable speaking publicly, or don't have time and can't make it to that meeting. You can definitely have a written statement and add it there. But I don't know about city committees and whether or not the same thing applies.
Thanks, Farnaz. Another question before I go to some pre-prepared ones is from Jose. After having analyzed the budget individually, what would be the two main changes that you would like to see in it? I don't know if anyone wants to start. I'll start with you, Laura.
Sure, yeah. So let's get rid of the giant like pie in the sky dream holes in the budget, like let's not have a budget that hopes that we get funding from the province for transit. If we get funding from the province for transit, great. If we don't, let's not say, oh no, the money didn't come through, now we're going to cut $40 million worth of your routes, because we know that is one possible outcome. We haven't seen what this scenario, we don't even know what that scenario looks like, but we know that's there. We know that there are a lot of people in the city who would dearly love to cut public transit service. We know for a lot of people, it is not seen as an essential service like it's seen for me. I know we don't use that wording for a lot of reasons, but honestly, it's an essential service. It is absolutely an essential service. So let's treat it like one, let's fund it like one. That is one huge change I'd like to see. I would also like to see really huge rethink of what our budget priorities are overall. Like, why are we looking at an austerity budget this year? Why are we saying the budget direction is 2.5% increase? You can even look at a city of Toronto with a conservative mayor. They voted for, I think it's a 6% budget increase. So why are we insisting that everything be in these tight little envelopes? I'm not saying that means the police budget needs to go hog wild and crazy big, but let's think about our community services budgets. Let's think about many of the services year after year where we simply have no increases. We're told to hold the line or increase by less than the rate of inflation. And the problem being that an increase of less than the rate of inflation is de facto cutting something. We can't, you got to pay for it somewhere. We got to walk to the well no matter what. So I would really like to know how on earth it is that we have to say, okay, let's keep tightening our belts. Let's keep shrinking this in when we know that an increase of an extra, 1.5% on taxes is, basically $100 a year. Like it's your Disney Plus, if we want to go use that example again. This isn't huge amounts of money we're talking about, yet the difference it would make, especially for marginalized people in our city, is enormous. And that's something I don't want people to ever lose focus of.
Thanks, Laura. That's a good point. But by comparison, a lot of other cities are raising property taxes by a significantly higher margin because of the loss of revenue from Bill 23. For example, Mississauga is raising their property taxes between 8 and 10%. In Toronto, as Laura said, about 6-7%. And other municipalities, similar amounts. So Ottawa is really sort of particular in that we're really raising it only by 2.5%. It's not super rational. If we're talking about being practical, even it's not. Farnaz? You're muted, Farnaz.
Okay. I would at minimum want to see a freeze to the police budget. I think that every time that they come to the table every year asking for more money, they're asking us to invest in hiring new police officers, and then they use a bunch of different needs in the community, and they're very real needs that people have to justify asking for that money. There's no evidence to suggest that they have any tools to be able to actually address those needs, prevent maybe the violence or harm that the community is facing because of those needs, or intervene in it in a meaningful way to keep people safe. So something that Inez said during the presentation of the budget was how people or police might invest in certain things that causes like a ripple effect in the future where they have to continue investing in it. And we see that with things like tasers when they buy, they call it less lethal, they're literally meant to kill, but less lethal weapons. And every year they have to repurchase them because they're saying that it doesn't meet certain standards. So that's like funds that continuously get spent. This year we heard that the chief of police was suggesting to buy body cameras, which usually this is a suggestion that comes up when it comes to police brutality, and people think that if you record it and if we have more footage of it, that somehow there's going to be more accountability and prevention, and we know that that's not true. The unfortunate murder of Tyree Nichols in Memphis shows us that, like, we have footage of it, but it didn't prevent him from dying. And I mean, what does accountability mean when like a life is lost? So that's the kind of thing where I think we're never gonna, with the logic that they use around increasing the police budget, we always hear the cop per pop logic. So increasing population requires us to increase more police. And the logic of that is that they really want police in every vicinity and crevice of your life, which again, it doesn't really prevent anything. And it just, for some people, it's unsafe. It leads to criminalization and disenfranchising certain communities. And we never really have that same logic when it comes to, for example, like paramedics or like healthcare or education and expanding those services. I think Ottawa has been at level 0 for a few years now when it comes to paramedic services. So many times, like, they don't have any cars to go out. So you could be in a crisis that requires a paramedic and there's no car to get to you. And we don't put as much urgency on that issue, but we always do with police. And then again, I'll go back, like they used increase in calls for service as a justification for more funds. But a lot of the times the increase that they have more calls for service is because there's no one else to call. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be the best person for the job, but yeah.
Thanks, Farnaz. Inez?
Yeah, I guess definitely echoing what Laura and Farnaz have brought up, but if I had to pick one thing.
Oh, you're muted for some reason. Okay, there you go. You're good.
My screen says am I still muted? Okay. Anyways, if there's one thing I would like to see, I would say more transparency. So in terms of how the city releases their documents, so having like one consolidated document so people can search through it and aren't forced to open 40 PDFs, making it very difficult to compare where money is coming from. I think that is super important, releasing like a draft budget book when they release all of their documents. Also, in terms of having line by line budgets for different areas of investment, you know, in daily spending, operational budget. Transit gets $700 million, and that is essentially presented in one big chunk. And I think it's super important to be able to know where that money is being spent. These are, like Laura said, this is an essential service, and it's important to know where that money is being invested, because there are gaps in access to transit that's extremely clear to everyone that takes transit. And it's very hard to be able to make assumptions and to be able to make the case of what is needed and where that money is needed when there isn't enough information to go off. So the main transparency. And then I guess in terms of the second thing, I'd like to see more investments that are proportionate to the scales of crisis we're seeing. So in terms of the housing crisis, in terms of COVID-19, I mean, infection rates are still very high. People are still dying of COVID. I don't think we're seeing any of the response is not measurable at all to the scale of the crisis. Also, in terms of drug toxicity crisis, I think these are areas the city can invest in, should invest in, and we're not really seeing a response that we need.
Thanks, Inez. And I suppose I'll just add in terms of transparency. Yeah, that's a big thing. Also making sure that we have a budget process that is starts a lot earlier, because if you write a big document and throw it at people a month before the budget's voted on, I mean, that's not really a collaborative process with residents. The budget process should start months in advance and include lots of residents and going out and asking people what they want. It shouldn't just be asking people what they think about the document once it's already been written. But of course, I think obviously the biggest thing for me in this budget is the cuts to transit. I mean, obviously policing is the thing, and Farnaz has already brought it up and others have brought it up, so I won't bring it up again. Of course, it's a big thing, but the cuts to transit are really significant. And that's certainly something we should fight against. And of course, in a time when people already have such low confidence in ridership, and we're already facing such significant cuts, and if we want people to come back to our transit system, the way that we're going to do it is to make it better, not continue to take funding away. And take buses off the road and things like that. But of course, there's a lot of other things we could talk about. But I see, Farnaz, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I saw a question in the chat about what about alternatives to calling police when the problem is a mental health issue, if the city's looking at this, and I was wondering if I could answer that. Sure,
go ahead.
Okay, so actually Vivic Research together with the 613-819 Black Hub did a plan of doing an alternatives to police for mental health crises. They presented it with graphics to the Ottawa Police Services Board and to city committees. Unfortunately, what the city didn't do was move towards that in the way that it was being asked to do, and that was done with a lot of consultations from service providers, people with lived experience, various communities, but they didn't really go towards that. Instead, they used funds that they decreased from the last year's police budget ask. So I think, if I remember correctly, police asked for 14 million. Instead, they were given 11 million, and that difference was moved towards the city to develop a alternative mental health crisis response by the city. But what they didn't do was take police out of that equation. They're still very much at the table. And we're hearing, we heard again while they were presenting the budget, the police did, that Eric Stubbs mentioned the fact that Toronto is showing promising numbers and that perhaps we should look at that, but we've already looked at that. It's just they're not adopting it in the way that I think Toronto has in some ways. They actually have different crisis responses that aren't police reliant, whereas we don't. And I think another thing is that 2016, I think they already tried doing a kind of collaborative response where they had psychiatrists going with police to calls, and the lead psychiatrist left that initiative. And I don't know what the reason is, but it didn't work because police are addressing the situation from a very specific risk management angle. And people in crisis often don't need that response, and it escalates it. And so they're not trained to de-escalate these situations. They're often trained to meet people who are in crisis with extremely violent responses. So that's where the city is at right now. I don't think that the mental health alternative strategy has actually put anything forward just yet, but it was in the works in the past year. But we'll see what that looks like.
And just want to address Khulud. Thanks, Farnaz. Khulud posted it in the chat, but our coalition has created an engagement guide that you can also find on the Ottawa Alternative Budget website, and it includes questions you can ask councillors on different subjects, on lots of other stuff, good stuff in there. Some short explanations of historical trends with different departments and things like that. So it's a great tool to look at before either you give a delegation or you go to your councillor consultation. What we didn't include in the presentation is also dates of councillor consultations, but you can find that on the city's website. It's a lot clearer how to participate in those on the city's website than it is to participate in city committees and boards. But there are lots of them coming up. So I really recommend folks attend those and ask their councillors questions, because, councillors, I would say, really take into account what their residents in their own wards tell them. So it does really have an impact if you talk to your councillor in your ward about that stuff. But of course, so does coming out and speaking at a meeting. Also, just to address, there are some comments in the chat also about how the process and the website and things are inaccessible, but this is a great point to talk about, to email your councillors and to talk about during your delegation. A lot of the stuff that some of us talk about while we delegate is also how inaccessible the process is. And I feel like something that councillors can really get behind is, one thing that's really easy, like putting a consolidated document on the website that's easy for people to look at and read, and something that's accessible for people with disabilities as well, as Sally is saying in the chat. So that's certainly something that people should bring up to councillors to make this a more accessible process, because as Inez and I were talking earlier this week, it seems like it's getting less and less accessible and less transparent every single year. So we don't have too much time left, but I'm going to go to some other questions that I have here that are a bit more broad. And some of these were addressed already, but I guess one thing, we have spoken about this already, but I don't know if folks can think about anything else, but like, what are some ways and some barriers that exist for people when they go to delegate? I mean, of course, like we've spoken about some things, but I guess what are some barriers and what are some ways that people can overcome those barriers and address them and whatnot? Laura, I saw you had your hand up, so I'll go to you.
Anyone who has a life is going to have a hard time delegating to a city committee. Let's just put that right out there. I have had very good fortune because there have been city committees and really you're relying on committee chairs, and frankly, respect where it's due. Former councillor Diane Deans was very accommodating. Numerous times I had to delegate to the police budget and have my turn moved because I had to pick up my kids from school or had childcare responsibilities. I sometimes delegated by phone in front of my kids' school waiting for pickup. It's not always easy to do, but if you communicate with the committee, they can sometimes accommodate you, not like massively, but they are willing to try and work with you when they can, a lot of the time. But you're going to have a hard time because frankly, these meetings are not held at accessible times. And frankly, any time of day can be difficult. We know for people in the evenings with young kids, often, heck, it's a lot easier for me to pull out of my workday for 30 minutes to do something than it is at 6:30 at night when I've got to try and feed kids, get them bathed and to bed. That's a really rough time of day for me. For people who've got PSWs and others coming to their houses in the evenings are often a difficult time. Yet so many of our consultations for this budget are scheduled in the evening. So many of the committee delegations during the day. So if you have a job where you can't step away from your desk, that is all of a sudden not an option for you. So just highlighting the huge barriers involved in participation. That is something really important that all of us can do. You can raise those with your counselor, you can raise those with committees in writing, or if you get to delegate in person, doing it there. But really talking about that, and not, if it has been hard to get there, take 2 seconds and explain that to people so that they know, that they don't think that this is convenient and fun and easy. because if we don't raise a stink about it, they think it's okay.
That's a great, excuse me, that's a great point to bring it up if it's a big inconvenience for you, right? Because, you know, one can say, you know, if councils were doing the right thing on a particular budget issue, if they weren't cutting transit by $47 million, well, I wouldn't be here speaking right now and take time out of my day or whatnot. So that's a great point from Laura. Farnaz, I think you wanted to say something about this, eh? Yes, go ahead. Oh, yes or no? Oh, sorry, you muted yourself. I think that's probably why. Oh, okay, go ahead.
Okay. I guess like one barrier, again, like going back to the police services board that they might be creating is the bylaw that would only allow you to speak if you haven't spoken within the previous 3 months. So they're trying to propose bylaw changes so that first you can only speak to agenda items, or like preference will be given to people who are speaking to agenda items. And then if you wanted to pose a topic that wasn't on the agenda, it would be up to the board, which I think it was previously like this too, or the committee to approve whether or not they're going to hear or listen to that. But sometimes it's like there are certain things that they don't want to talk about, but we need to talk about. And so if they decide that we're never going to talk about it, then you might not get to in that space. And then the bylaw is also if more than 12 people sign up, it would limit your delegation from 5 minutes to 3 minutes. And it's already hard to fit a lot of things in 5 minutes. So 3 minutes it's even harder. And they're also trying to move the time that you would be delegating. Typically, it would start, the meeting would start at 4 p.m. on a Monday. And then whenever the delegations are happening, that's when you would talk. But they wanted to move that to noon, so between noon and 1. And their justification was this was more accessible because even if you're working, it's your lunchtime. But people spending their lunchtime just waiting on a call for their 5 minutes is not a fair ask of people, especially when that lunchtime is supposed to be their break. And while I think a lot of us advocated for virtual access or virtual meetings so that people who can't physically show up there can still delegate, they did grant that for the month of February, but under a really poor framing that they were worried about their physical safety, which is honestly like not really fair to delegates because there's a huge power imbalance when delegates are walking in a room filled with armed police officers and police board members who have the power to make so many really big decisions that impact our lives. And for delegates to be framed as like the dangerous ones was honestly like a tactic of weaponized victimhood in this scenario, I think. But yeah, I think that's a barrier for the police board that we should watch out for on February 27th. And if folks have the ability or time or space to like write in or even come and delegate against that, I would encourage you to do that.
Yeah, and to that, we'll before the end of this presentation, we'll go back to those slides with all the information about the meetings and things like that. So I think we'll probably just take like 2 more. I see Raymond, you have a question. Raymond, do you want to write your question in the chat? Because it'd be a bit easier if you could do that. If you can't, then I can go to you. But if you can do that, that would be great. And then while you're writing, I'll ask another question from here. And I also want to thank Khulud, obviously, who had, you know, at the beginning of the presentation, and also is responding to a lot of your comments in the chat, and also to Tom Ledgley, who is does a lot of communications help and work for Horizon Ottawa and is live tweeting this session right now on Horizon Ottawa's Twitter. So thank you, Tom. And I guess so. This is again like sort of back to the beginning, but if there's anything else that you wanted to add, I guess to this, but. Where was the question? I've never made a public delegation before. Do you have any advice on effectively getting any points across? I know some folks addressed that like briefly earlier, but if there's anything else that you would add to that, I know there were some things that folks said in terms of you know, addressing certain things, but is there anything else, maybe like how you would write something beforehand, or or like what you would write or what you put into something. Is there anything that people want to add to that? Or Inez, do you want to?
Sure. I guess kind of two thoughts on this. I think one is having support that is available after you delegate. So it doesn't even need to be people that are also speaking in the meeting, but like someone that you can reach out to, that you can talk to on the phone, or you can text, just because it can be a really stressful experience. And depending on like the way your delegation is received, like if you get questions that sometimes can catch you off guard, it can be a really stressful experience, or it can also just feel a little bit disappointing and frustrating if you're not getting a response. But in terms of preparing, I think one thing that's important to consider is that your audience is bigger than just the city councils or the board members that you're speaking to. You're also being heard by the people that might be listening on the live stream or the other people in the room. So it's giving you an opportunity to share with a lot of people. It's also a way to talk to your community and feel connected in terms of like you're all bringing similar issues. You're not alone in the concerns that you're bringing. And it's also giving you, you know, like if there's information that you've found in the budget that you want to share, you're not only bringing it to city council that you don't, like, we don't really know how they receive that information and how they digest it, but you're also speaking to people in your community to whom that information is equally valuable, and they might be really happy to learn it too.
Thanks. And I'll also say what so Raymond said. One, find a friendly counselor that will allow you to get opportunities to delegate, and I think that third point, get counselors to ask clarifying questions that will give you more time to speak. So that's a great point. Like if you have a good relationship with a city councilor, your counselor or somebody else, you could email them and ask them to like ask you a question after delegation is over if you want to speak for longer, and that's a great point. Some counselors will do that. And then another thing is get other groups to present so you get more time. And then if you have a lot of things to say and you don't want to repeat things, you can talk to other people and they can maybe delegate another time in the meeting and say things that maybe you don't have the time to say. Laura, anything to add to what you said earlier maybe around this? Or
I guess just if you have like a couple really key points you want to make sure you get out, write them down even just for yourself. Some people feel really good about reading off a script. Other people prefer to just kind of go off the cuff. But if there's really key points or key facts and figures, just jot those down so you have them handy so that you're not left after going like, oh crap, I really wanted to say something and I didn't get the chance to. But also, I guess my other point about delegations would be like that, yes, we're really in focus with the budget right now, but this stuff happens all year long. All year long, there are going to be questions and issues that come up. So don't feel like you just have to do this once. If you find that if you find it effective or you find that you can make the time, please do take the time to consult those agendas when you have a chance and make delegations when you can, because a lot of these issues are ongoing issues like holes in transit funding. That's going to be an issue this entire fiscal year. So if it bothers you now, feel free to jump in again and again and again and ask what's going on with that. That's something you're allowed to do and you're welcome to do. And that's called accountability and transparency.
Thanks, Laura. Farnaz?
Am I? Okay.
You're muted now.
Okay.
Good
I
now.
think one logistically that I do for the 5 minutes is I'll write it out and then I will like at least rehearse it once and time it just to make sure that like you can, sometimes I put too many words in there and then I run out of breath as I'm trying to fit it all under 5 minutes. Don't do that, because then all of it is just a word jumble and you don't get through much of it. But another thing in terms of, I think something Laura was saying, but in terms of like, there's going to be multiple other opportunities that you're going to want to speak to, and to find a way that makes it sustainable for you to do that. I think getting together and like organizing a group with people who share similar concerns about similar things with you could help with kind of lessening the burden. So it could be that one person who can look at the agenda and figure out like what they're talking about, what day, and then let everybody else know, or like and unpack what the narrative around it, and then you can all have a discussion about how you want to approach it. I think that has been most sustainable for me. I think if it was just me on my own trying to like figure out when I'm going to speak to what, I probably wouldn't be speaking out as much as I do now. But having a group of people there where someone raises a concern and I'm like, okay, I care about that too, I got to deal with this and I have to speak to it, is really helpful. So if you have people that share the same concerns as you, get together with them. If you see groups that are in the city who are raising concerns and you care about those, try to engage with them, tap into their conversations, and then yeah, it'll be easier.
Thanks, Farnaz. And so I think we'll just, so I'm going to go back to we're not finishing just yet. We're going to just for another couple minutes stay on so I can share my screen again. So we'll end that portion there at least. I'll just share the screen again just to go back to the presentation. Here it is. And I'll just go back. Here was we had that portion about sort of a template that Khulud had put together about you know what should be in a written delegation. So I wanted to share that again. So you can, you introduce yourself right at the beginning, who you are. If you want to, you can show up as an individual and individual residents, which is sometimes better, but you can also say that you're there on behalf of a group if you are. You also, clearly state the issue you're addressing to. You might also want to add in a land acknowledgement, of course, as well, as a lot of the committees don't when they start. But they're getting a bit better at that. Tell them why it's important. And you can add a personal anecdote in there to make it more personal, which is always good, especially with things like transit, policing, etc., transportation. Give examples of the problem and or solution, and then tell them what you want them to do and when, and summarizing and closing remarks. So this is, a great summary of sort of what to do. You can, and in the alternative budget, there are also some examples of what other cities have done. So it's also really great to bring in examples of what other cities have done throughout the world, but also in Canada. Of course, that's a better comparison. Talking about what Montreal is doing, or talking about what some cities in Ontario are doing that Ottawa is not. And that's quite compelling because that shows people that is actually being done and it can be done, right? So that's always those concrete examples to bring in that what other cities are doing is always a great thing to do. But before we end, I'm just going to go over, the other committees again and the dates. Not that far. So coming up so tomorrow there's the Finance and Corporate Services Committee, which might be too late to sign up at this point, but the Transit Committee Commission on Thursday, it's at 9:30 in the morning. But of course doesn't mean you're going to be speaking at 9:30 in the morning. And you sign up and say that you want to speak to the transit budget. But as I also said, there might be we might put together an email campaign too. So if you want to do that or just email them, that's also okay. But it would be great to have a lot of people come out and speak there against the cuts that are being proposed by Sutcliffe. So that's February 9th. Again, you can show up in person at City Hall or register to speak virtually. There's also the Emergency Preparedness and Protective Services Committee, which deals with things like fire and paramedic services and other stuff like that. So lots of stuff to speak there, as Farnaz had noted earlier too, about the level 0 stuff and how not a lot of funding going towards paramedic services, and also like dealing with natural disasters, other stuff. Planning and Housing Committee, February 15th at 9:30. The Environment and Climate Change Committee, February 21st at 9:30. So good to speak there as well. Transportation Committee, as Khulud alluded to earlier, there's a lot of things to talk about there, like the Airport Parkway widening, if you oppose that in the budget, more cycling and pedestrian infrastructure. Police Services Board on February 27th at 4 p.m., but also the Police Services Board meeting on February 15th at 10 a.m. to sign up for that. Community Services Committee on February 28th, which is the last one before the budget. And also there's the Ottawa Public Library Board. And also, and then the budget is tabled on the 1st of March at 10 in the morning, and you can't speak at city council meetings. So these committees are some of your only opportunities to speak. And of course, on the city website, there's also the councillor consultations as well that you should speak at and sign up for those too. Of course, and those are usually in the evening, so those are sometimes easier to attend as well. And before the last thing that we'll share is just this list of some of the emails. And I'll let folks take a bit of a look at that. If there's any particular committee there that you want to sign up to speak, so you email those any of those people, ask to speak to the city budget, and they'll sign you up to speak at the agenda at the next meeting. And then, you know, folks, if you find out last minute that you can't make the meeting, it's totally fine to sign up and then drop out the last minute. That happens a lot, or just don't show up or whatever. That happens a lot at committees. So if you're not sure that you can make it, you know, you can still sign up and then not end up coming out. That's also totally fine. And then you can send in some sort of written thing if you can't. So don't worry about that either. And yeah, so there's a bunch of emails there, and we'll share some of those later as well. And as I mentioned earlier, this is being recorded, so it will be available afterwards for folks to share and to pass around. And some of the resources like the engagement guide on the website, on the Ottawa Alternative Budget website, will be shared. So thanks everyone for coming out. It was a great session, and thanks to everyone who spoke today. Khulud, who's up there, not in these four squares. Thanks Laura for joining us, Farnaz and Inez for giving their insights on the budget and stuff like that. And I hope this was helpful and informative for folks. And the presentation will be passed out around by email to everyone afterwards, and it'll also go up on Horizon Ottawa's YouTube channel. And I'll also finish by putting in a shameless plug that you know, a lot of us, you know, are able to put on events like this, Horizon Ottawa, to help with this and do some work around the budget. You know, but we need resources obviously to do it as well. So if you can donate, I would encourage you to do so. horizonottawa.ca to our donate page, and it would be gratefully appreciated. And I'll leave it there. Thanks so much. And I hope to see some of you folks at the Transit Commission meeting on the 9th and all the other committee meetings, Police Services Board on the 15th and all that. So stay tuned, folks. And thanks again to our panelists. And thanks to Tom again for live tweeting the event. Thanks so much.